I found this story on Reddit a few weeks ago, and for some reason, I can't get it out of my head. It wasn't written like the usual urban exploration posts, grainy pictures of graffiti-covered walls, broken glass, old office chairs rotting in hallways. This one read more like a confession, almost like the writer wasn't just documenting a place but trying to leave behind a warning. They said they had stumbled across an abandoned laboratory on the outskirts of town, part of what used to be a chemical institute. The building was barely visible from the road, hidden behind a line of leafless trees and half-collapsed fencing. According to the post, the main entrance was sealed shut, but one of the side doors had been forced open long ago. Inside, the hallways smelled of rust and mold, but beneath that there was something sharper, the acrid tang of old reagents, the same smell you remember from high school chemistry class, only multiplied by decades of neglect. The part that fascinated me most was the way the writer described the interior. They weren't just listing objects, they were painting a scene. The main hall of the laboratory was filled with long benches, their metal surfaces eaten away by corrosion. Glassware was scattered everywhere, beakers, test tubes, even a few massive flasks with strange mineral deposits at the bottom. Some of the bottles still had faded labels in Cyrillic script: sulfuric acid, chloroform, potassium dichromate. Others were marked only with numbers. The fluorescent lights overhead were long dead, and the only illumination came from the pale sunlight filtering through dirty windows. Dust floated in the air like slow snow. On one of the benches, beneath a crust of grime, the explorer found something unusual: a stack of thick journals bound in grey cardboard. Their covers were brittle, water-stained, but the pages inside were still intact. The handwriting was meticulous, almost mechanical, each entry headed with a date and an experiment number. The dates ranged from the late 1960s to the mid-1980s. At first, the entries seemed ordinary enough: notes about reactions, temperature changes, failures, yields. But the longer they read, the stranger the details became. The author of the Reddit post mentioned phrases that didn't make sense in a chemistry context, things like temporal variance, observer discrepancy, subjective decay rate. One formula was scrawled over 3 entire pages, lines and symbols that didn't belong to any known system. The explorer wrote that they felt an overwhelming unease as they flipped through the pages, as if the words weren't meant to be read outside of their original context. At one point, they even claimed the air seemed heavier around the journals, like the dust stopped moving when they opened them. They weren't sure if it was their imagination, but they swore the silence of the lab deepened, as though the whole place was holding its breath. The post ended abruptly. The writer said they had stuffed 2 of the journals into their backpack before leaving, planning to examine them at home. Their last line has been echoing in my head ever since. The entries stop in 1984, but the dates continue. There are whole sections written for years that hadn't happened yet. That's where the thread cut off. No follow-up, no update. Just silence. And that's why I can't stop thinking about it. I couldn't help myself. After reading that Reddit post, I started digging. I wanted to know if the building they described was real, or just some elaborate creepypasta. A few hours of searching through old maps and local news archives gave me a lead. There really had been a chemical research institute on the outskirts of town, shut down in the mid-1980s after a fire in one of the wings. Officially, the fire had caused irreparable structural damage, but no one was ever charged, and the details were oddly vague. The coordinates matched the descriptions almost perfectly. I remember staring at the satellite image, a long, rectangular structure half buried in trees, roof sagging, shadows suggesting broken windows. There was even a half-erased road leading to it, now overgrown but still faintly visible. The more I looked, the more I knew I had to see it for myself. When I finally drove out there, the place looked exactly as it had been described. The fence was twisted and rusted, the main gate sealed with a heavy chain. I circled around until I found a side entrance where part of the wall had crumbled. The air inside was cooler, stale, as though it hadn't been disturbed in decades. I remember how the silence swallowed the sound of my footsteps the moment I crossed the threshold. The first thing I noticed was the lingering smell, metallic, sour, layered with dust. Old reagents, just like the Reddit writer had said. The hallways were lined with doors, most hanging open, revealing empty offices with peeling paint and overturned filing cabinets. A few had stacks of yellowing paper still inside, warped by dampness, ink bled into unreadable stains. But the real prize was the laboratory itself. I stepped into a wide, cavernous room filled with rows of benches. The air felt heavier in there, as though all the dust and memories of the place had gathered in one spot. Glass shards crunched under my boots. On the far wall, a massive chalkboard was covered with half-erased symbols and faded equations. Someone had tried to scrub them away, but faint lines still clung to the surface like scars. That's when I found them, the journals. Exactly as they'd been described. Grey cardboard covers, water-stained, stacked in uneven piles across a bench. I brushed the dust off one with my sleeve and flipped it open. The handwriting was neat, rigid, like a machine. Dates scrawled across the top of every page. And then, 1991, 1995, 2003. The words felt wrong as I read them, like I wasn't supposed to see them. Experiments noted in cold, clinical tone, but the terminology grew stranger and stranger. Temporal window stable at 407 seconds. Subjective decay rate exceeds projection. Observer interference confirmed. I don't know why, but one phrase made my stomach twist. The experiment is aware of itself. I snapped the book shut. My pulse was hammering in my ears. The room felt different now, colder, like the air itself was watching me. And then I heard it. A faint sound, so out of place in that silent ruin that at first I thought it was in my head. A rhythmic tick, like the click of a metronome. Slow, deliberate. Coming from deeper inside the lab. I wasn't supposed to be there. I knew it. But still, I followed the sound. The sound drew me across the laboratory, my boots crunching over broken glass and scraps of paper that had long since fused into the floor. It was subtle at first, like a faint tapping just beyond the range of clear hearing. But the closer I got to the far corner of the room, the sharper it became. Tick. Pause. Tick. Pause. Not random. A rhythm. The noise seemed to come from a narrow doorway tucked behind a bank of rusting cabinets. I squeezed through, brushing flakes of peeling paint off my jacket, and found myself in a much smaller room. It felt like a control chamber of some kind, the kind of space where technicians would have monitored whatever experiments had been conducted in the main hall. Everything was coated in dust, yet strangely, the air felt different here, thinner, almost metallic on my tongue. On one side of the room, a row of filing cabinets stood like silent soldiers, their drawers locked or jammed open, papers spilling out in yellowed curls. On the other side, a massive piece of equipment sat bolted to the wall. It was a boxy, archaic-looking machine, its metal faceplate dotted with knobs, broken dials, and a row of indicator lights long dead. And in the center of the machine, perched on a cracked wooden shelf, was the source of the sound, a metronome. Its triangular body was chipped and faded, the pendulum swinging back and forth with impossible steadiness. No power source, no one to wind it, yet it ticked, slow and deliberate, as though keeping time for something I couldn't see. I stared at it for what felt like minutes, waiting for it to stop. It never did. On the desk beside it lay another journal, separate from the stacks I had found earlier. This one was different, bound in black instead of grey, its edges worn to bare cardboard. I hesitated before opening it, as though the moment I did something would notice me. Finally, I brushed the dust aside and flipped to the first page. The handwriting was the same, neat, mechanical, but the entries were shorter, fragmented, almost like notes scribbled in haste. Window reached 407 seconds. Oscillation persists. Operator error suspected. No observer present. The system resists closure. Pages and pages of similar fragments followed, each one more cryptic than the last. The dates at the top of the entries pushed further and further beyond the supposed closure of the institute. 1987, 1993, 2001, 2012. I froze when I saw the final entry, scrawled in darker ink that looked fresher than the rest. 407 is not a number. It's a door. At that exact moment, the metronome slowed. Tick. Tick. I swear I could feel the pauses stretching longer, the air itself bending around the silence. The dust seemed to hang still, frozen in place. I wanted to slam the journal shut, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, locked in the strange cadence of that device. And then, just as suddenly, it resumed its steady pace. Tick. Pause. Tick. Pause. The spell broke, and I gasped like I'd been underwater. I stuffed the black journal into my backpack without thinking. The instant it slid inside, the machine on the wall gave a faint groan, like settling metal. I didn't stay to see if it did more. I backed out of the room, my flashlight beam trembling across the peeling walls, and fled into the main laboratory hall. But even as I left, I could still hear it faintly behind me. Tick. Pause. Tick. Pause. I didn't stop moving until I was halfway back across the main hall, my flashlight beam bouncing erratically against rusted benches and shattered glassware. My chest felt tight, my pulse hammering in my ears. But no matter how far I walked, the ticking seemed to linger, faint but insistent, like it had imprinted itself into the air around me. I forced myself to slow down. Panic wouldn't help. If the Reddit post had been telling the truth, if someone else had already taken journals from this place, then I wasn't the first to disturb it. That thought should have comforted me, but instead it made the silence heavier. Where had they gone? Why had they never updated their post? I decided to search the rest of the lab before leaving. Part of me was terrified, but another part couldn't resist the pull of the mystery. The rows of benches gave way to smaller adjoining rooms, storage closets, prep areas, a chemical cold room whose door had been left ajar. Inside the cold room, shelves sagged under the weight of old glass jars filled with cloudy liquid. Some labels were still legible: Specimen A, Cycle 3, and one scrawled only with the number 407. I didn't look too closely at what floated inside. The far end of the hall led to another locked door, heavier than the rest, with a faded sign above it, Rive. The handle resisted, but after a few pushes, it gave with a shriek of rust. A blast of stale air rushed out, thick with the smell of mildew and something faintly sweet, almost like rotting fruit. The archive was a long, narrow corridor lined with shelves. Boxes were stacked to the ceiling, many collapsing under their own weight. Papers littered the floor like brittle leaves. My flashlight picked out diagrams, typed reports, reel-to-reel tapes, and a stack of thin folders tied with string. I sat down on a low crate and untied one. The documents inside were in Russian, dated 1973, stamped with official seals. Most of the pages were dense tables of data, but tucked in the back was something different, a photograph. It was black and white, badly faded, showing a group of 6 men in lab coats standing around a machine. At the center of the image was the same boxy apparatus I'd seen in the control chamber, only intact, its dials lit, cables trailing across the floor. And there it was, the same metronome, perched on top of the console like a conductor's baton. On the back of the photo, in faint pencil, someone had written a single line: "Only one must observe." The hairs rose on my neck. I shoved the photograph back into the folder and stood, suddenly desperate to leave. But as I turned, something caught my eye on the far shelf, a tape reel, its label peeling, marked in the same mechanical handwriting as the journals, EXP 407, Final. I don't know why I took it. Maybe curiosity had already infected me, maybe I felt like I'd already gone too far. I slid the reel into my bag beside the black journal. The metal shelving groaned as if in protest. And then, silence. Not the ordinary silence of an abandoned building, but something deeper, absolute. Even my own breathing sounded muffled, like it was happening behind glass. My flashlight flickered once, twice, before steadying. That was when I realized the ticking had stopped. I left the archive room with the tape reel clutched against my chest, my flashlight beam jittering over the walls. The air still carried that uncanny silence, heavy and deliberate, as though the building itself were listening. I didn't hear the ticking anymore, but the absence of it felt worse. Like something that had always been there had suddenly withdrawn. I wanted to get out. Every step toward the exit seemed to stretch longer than it should, the corridors repeating themselves in impossible ways. I could have sworn I passed the same overturned chair twice, the same cracked window with ivy creeping through its frame. By the third time, my throat went dry. I forced myself to keep moving, telling myself the building wasn't playing tricks on me. I was simply disoriented. When I finally reached daylight bleeding in through a broken doorway, relief washed over me. The outside air smelled fresher, thinner. But before I left, I made one mistake. I looked back. From the shadowed hall behind me, faint and irregular, I heard it again. Tick. Tick. I bolted. Back home, I didn't unpack my bag for 2 days. The journals, the black notebook, the tape reel, they sat at the foot of my bed like coiled snakes. I told myself I should throw them out, burn them, anything. But curiosity gnawed at me in the quiet hours of the night. I found myself thumbing through the black journal again, rereading the fragments about observer interference and temporal windows. Every page made my skin crawl, yet I couldn't stop. On the third night, I dug out an old reel-to-reel player from my grandfather's attic. The belts were dry, the motor sluggish, but after some coaxing, it whirred to life. My hands shook as I loaded the tape labeled EXP407, Final. The reel spun. At first, there was nothing but static. Then a voice crackled through, flat, clinical, male. It spoke Russian, steady and unbroken, as if reading from a script. My Russian is poor, but I recognized words: observation, window, continuity. Every few minutes, the voice paused, and in the silence, the faint ticking of the metronome bled through the recording. Then came something else. A second voice, softer, almost whispering, overlapping the first. I turned up the volume, leaning closer, but the words slipped through like water. It wasn't Russian. It wasn't any language I knew. The whisper grew louder as the primary voice continued, until they overlapped entirely, one clinical, one urgent, both relentless. And then, a knock. 3 sharp raps, so close and so sudden I nearly fell out of my chair. But it wasn't coming from the speakers. It came from the wall behind me. I froze. The reel kept turning, the whispers swelling, but I couldn't take my eyes off that patch of plaster. I swear I saw the dust on the wall shift outward, as if something inside had pressed its hand against it. I slammed the machine off. The silence that followed was suffocating. But the worst part? Even after I unplugged the reel-to-reel, the faint ticking didn't stop. It was coming from inside my bag. I didn't sleep that night. The ticking from my bag continued long after the tape had stopped. Sometimes it grew louder, sometimes fainter, but never once did it fall out of rhythm. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the pendulum of that metronome swinging in the dark, steady as a heartbeat. By dawn, I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped the bag, half expecting to see the black journal vibrating on its own. But everything inside was still. The reel, the grey notebooks, the photo I'd pulled from the archive, all inert. Yet the sound persisted, as though it were lodged in the air itself. I pulled out the black journal, flipping through the pages with trembling fingers. Near the back, I noticed something I hadn't seen before: faint indentations on the paper, as if someone had written hard enough on a missing sheet to leave an impression. I angled the pages toward the window light, tracing the grooves with my eyes until a phrase emerged, scrawled in jagged letters. "Do not be the second observer." My skin went cold. That afternoon, against all common sense, I brought the tape reel to a friend of mine who worked in the archives at the university. I didn't tell her much, only that I'd found it in a box of junk from my grandfather's attic. She threaded it into a professional player and hit start. At first it was the same, the clinical Russian voice, the ticking, the overlapping whisper. She frowned, adjusting the knobs, muttering that the secondary track wasn't a recording artifact, it was deliberate. Then she froze. Because this time, the whispering voice was speaking English. Clear, hushed, unmistakable. And it wasn't random. It was describing the room we were sitting in. Word for word. The desk is cluttered with papers. The window is cracked on the left side. 2 people sit. 1 listens. 1 observes. My stomach dropped. My friend turned pale and reached for the stop button, but before she could touch it, the machine powered off by itself. The reel spun down into silence. We stared at each other, neither of us speaking. Finally, she shoved the reel back into its case and told me to take it away, immediately. Her voice was sharp, almost panicked. She didn't want to see me with it again. I left without arguing. That night, I locked the journals, the tape, everything, into a trunk at the back of my closet. I told myself I'd never open it again. But even now, as I write this, I can hear the faint ticking in the quiet of my apartment. Sometimes it comes from the closet. Sometimes from the wall. And sometimes, from right behind me. I think about the last line in that Reddit post, the one that hooked me in the first place. The entries stop in 1984, but the dates continue. Last week, I checked the black journal again. Against my better judgment, I turned to the final page. There was a new entry, written in the same neat, mechanical hand. It was dated tomorrow.